I'm Cliff Ribner, and if you're like most people, you watched President Trump's speech last night, giving it's like a State of the Union address, and he has all these great ideas. He wants to reform everything, get rid of all the corruption in Washington. He's got these Doge people looking for ridiculous payments that are being made by the federal government. He recited some of them. But there's 4 reasons why he's not going to be able to reform anything unless he gets Congress to do one thing. And that one thing is the Senate has to repeal the filibuster rule. The filibuster rule is antithetical to the entire republic. We're supposed to be a democratic republic in which the people elect their representatives, the chief magistrate, who is the president, and the members of Congress. And the president makes all the decisions that the president makes. He's the entire executive branch. Everyone who works in the Constitution, he is literally the executive branch. It's him. It's all embodied in his person. Under the Constitution, the vice president has zero power whatsoever until he becomes president, or unless he becomes president. Any power he has is simply whatever the president lets him have. And there have been times in the past when the vice president happened to be the actual president's chief opponent. Anyway, that was the beginning of the republic. Since then, we've had political parties so the president and the vice president are always of the same party. But that doesn't mean that they always get along. It happens in modern times more and more. The vice president becomes second in command to the president. But the president alone, under the Constitution, is the executive branch. Under the Constitution, he's allowed to fire and hire anyone he wants there. No constraints whatsoever. That's what it means to be the president. And yet, over the years, past Congresses and presidents have passed legislation to bind the hands not only of the president, but also of the Congress. And what this is breaking a fundamental rule. It's called the dead hand rule. This is basic constitutional law, recognized by the Supreme Court in the Winstar case, that the dead hand of the past is not allowed to control the present. The past legislatures and presidents who are no longer in office are not allowed to dictate what the present president and the Congress are allowed to do. Basic constitutional law, and past presidents and Congresses have gotten laws passed which completely violate that. But there's 3 big ones. There's all these Civil Service Protection Acts. They began in 1871. And most recently, there is the 1974 there's a Civil Service Act beginning in 1974. I'm sorry, 1978. They reformed the whole thing. And there is the Budget Control and Impoundment Act that was passed in 1974. That was to get back at Nixon, but it did much more. What it does is it binds the hands of Congress and the president about what they can put in the budget and what they can do as far as passing tax laws. They have to follow rules that have been created by previous Congresses directing what they're allowed to put in there and what they're not. And they have to, there's all sorts of gimmicks in it where they have to pretend that things cost money, like a tax cut. They have to pretend costs money, so they have to pay for that somewhere else. So they can't just pass a tax cut. This bound the hands of President Reagan so that he couldn't really pass his original tax cut in 1981. They had a delayed effective date. So we were in a recession with continuing terrible inflation for 3 years. And that's exactly the way the Democrats wanted it. Because what that did was, until the law became effective, it got effective in 1983, and there was huge success. And in that 1 year, it was enough to overcome the unpopularity that had been building up for the previous 3 years as a result of the misery from the delayed effective date. That's the type of thing this legislation does. And it requires them to follow all sorts of rules. when they when they pass laws having to do with budgets and taxes, spending, anything like that, unless it's in an exception. They make exceptions also, but it's the dead hand of the past in legislation dictating what they can do. And there's also the civil service reform laws beginning in 1871, which bind the hand of the president as far as hiring and firing people. It's all these rules, completely unconstitutional, but they put them in there, and then they did it again in 1978. Was it 78? Anyway, what these are the dead hand of the past. And what they've also done is, beginning in 1806, they've had the filibuster rule, which violates the basic principle of Republican form of government. And by the way, one of the things in the Constitution, the federal government guarantees that each of the states will have a Republican form of government, and it's supposed to have one also. It doesn't make the guarantee there, but it's described in the Constitution, each step. And one of the most important features of Republican form of government is that, except for certain special things like convicting a president in an impeachment or overriding a veto, which are specified in the Constitution, all the votes by the legislature are supposed to be majority rule, because if a supermajority is required, as is required for those special things in the Constitution, what happens is the defeated minority, gets a veto. And last night in the presidential speech, you got to see what the chances are of that defeated minority, the Democrats, going along with anything that President Trump wants. They won't do it. They won't even clap for a kid overcoming cancer. They won't even show any acknowledgement if a kid gets into West Point. They are opposed to everything he does. So President Trump, as long as that power is given to the minority of vetoing what the majority wants, which is what the filibuster rule does, nothing's going to get passed, and most importantly, nothing's going to get repealed. And we've got 150 years of terrible legislation passed by all sorts of terrible presidents and Congresses, particularly beginning with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a communist and an elitist. He had absolute contempt for the people of America. He thought we should just be run by experts, and they should give us our orders. And that's the way everything's been set up with these bureaucracies. These bureaucracies get to give us orders. We don't see it unless we come directly under their thumb. But they get their noses into every nook and cranny of every aspect of the economy. There are all these labor rules. They get to basically dictate the terms of every employment contract. It's terrible. It violates freedom of contract in the most basic way. And all of that stuff has been there since 1934 with the Wagner Act. Some of the worst stuff was passed under FDR. But we still have all the New Deal legislation that was passed under FDR. None of it's been repealed. And it can't be, because even when Republicans have a supermajority, they never have 60 votes. And so even when Republicans have majorities in both houses of Congress and the president, they don't have enough votes to overcome the filibuster rule. And that's what's required under the filibuster rule to repeal any legislation. That's why all that stuff is there forever. The legislation, and when they create these agencies, the agencies pass their own laws. They call them regulations because they don't qualify as laws. Article 1, Section 7 defines specific procedures that are required for an actual law to be a law, and none of those regulations qualify. The procedures they have for doing them are in the Administrative Procedure Act, which has totally different procedures. And it doesn't involve the Congress except in the last minute. And it permits the legislature, permits these unelected bureaucrats to create laws that the Senate and the House have to reject. That's that's the only voice they have. They get to reject it instead of they both have to pass it, which is the way it's done in the Constitution. So all of those regulations, none of them should have the force of law because none of them qualify under Article 1 of the Constitution. And Article 1, the beginning of the Constitution, after the preamble, says all legislative power, all, shall be in the Congress, not in any of these bureaucracies. It doesn't even get to shared by anybody. Congress is the only one that's allowed to pass actual laws. And the procedures for each law are very complicated and they're very specific. And if they don't do it, it doesn't qualify as a law. And what's happened is the Senate on its own, beginning in about 1806, but it's gone through various changes of text, but it's the filibuster rule. It's what requires 60 votes to repeal anything. And as long as that's there, President Trump is going to end up in court every time he does anything of any significance because his hands are tied with respect to all the federal employees under that various civil service legislation in 1871 and in the 1970s. And his hands are tied with respect to his and the Congress's hands are tied with respect to tax legislation and budget legislation, anything having to do with anything of any importance by the acts in the 1970s. So the Congress and the president from 1970 is basically ruling today, even though they're not in office. And that's what the filibuster rule permits to continue. And no one in Washington is even talking about it. President Trump, who has nothing but good intentions about getting the swamp drained, didn't even mention the filibuster rule. And the only Republican senator in charge, John Thune, has already said he's made a point. He's not going to repeal the filibuster rule. So he's guaranteeing that we will see no progress. Now, it happens that Congress is always detested. It's got about its disapproval rating is always between 70 and 80%, sometimes above 80. It happens that since President Trump got elected, the approval rating of Congress has gone up. It's still not that high, but it's gone up by about 20 points. And that's in anticipation of him making these changes. But he's not going to be able to make any of the important changes. He can only do so much with executive orders because the way our republic is set up, the most powerful branch of the three is the legislative branch. It's the one that writes the laws, and it's the one that has the power to repeal the laws. It's the one that writes laws about everything. And if the president doesn't have a law to back him, then he loses in court. And then it's just up to the courts whether in the margins he's there. Anyway, I'm Cliff Ribner, and if you like what I have to say, please follow me.